Take a look around. The frames in your walls, the tiles in your kitchen, even the components in the screen that you're watching this on probably came from all around the world. The clothes you're wearing, the car you drive, even the food you eat was most likely imported from overseas. The companies in your country pay millions, even billions, to import goods that we as consumers buy every single day. But why do these companies do this? Why don't they just produce these everyday products themselves from beginning to end, from the batteries to the computer itself? They do this because it's either cheaper to make that good overseas, the country isn't as technologically advanced as some others are, or your country just doesn't have that good to use. This constant competition for better prices made 99% of the world's economies heavily rely on trading with one another. However, this thing called trade came with a new problem. The need for a global reserve currency accepted by every country as payment for these goods and services. This new global reserve currency turned out to be the US dollar. But why the US dollar? Why not just change it to any other currency, or even Bitcoin? And what's holding countries to this inflationary currency? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. The secret behind the US dollar as a reserve currency. Chapter 1. The World After Darkness. So, let's go back to September 1939. Adolf Hitler, the Chancellor of Germany, orders his soldiers to invade Poland, hoping to settle Germans on Polish land and eliminate the Polish people. Britain and France don't agree with that and declare war on Germany. More countries get involved, they pick sides, and the whole event spirals out of control, marking the beginning of the Second World War. Fast forward, August 6th, 1945. Hitler's dead and the fighting in Europe has come to an end, but Japan is still holding out. America takes action and drops 2 atomic bombs on Japan, Fat Man on Nagasaki and Little Boy on Hiroshima. This action led to Japan's surrender 1 month later on September 2nd, signifying the end of the Second World War. Now, you may be wondering what this has to do with the US dollar. Well, back in July of 1944, when bloody battles still raged in Europe, delegates from 44 nations met at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They started the conversation about the current economic status of the countries affected by the war, which was basically every country they can think of. The main purpose of these talks, though, was to agree on a system of economic order and international cooperation that would help these countries recover from the devastation of the war and foster long-term global growth. The delegates, all 730 of them, deliberated terms from the 1st to the 22nd July, signing what would be known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. This agreement started the application of a system of rules, institutions, and procedures to regulate the international monetary system. Not only that, but it also set up an international bank with the purpose to finance the reconstruction of European nations devastated by the war. The United States, which controlled 2/3 of the world's gold supply, insisted that the Bretton Woods system should rest on gold. And since the US dollar's value was directly linked to America's stockpile of physical gold, the US dollar should be the one to be used as the global reserve currency. This marked the start of the US dollar being used as the global reserve currency in trading. Chapter 2. The Gold Standard. As I mentioned before, the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and any other central banks around the world could exchange the dollars they held for gold. This basically means that having dollars or gold were basically the same. And you could argue that having dollars was slightly better, since it's easier to carry around $1 million in paper rather than carrying it in gold. For the next 25 years, it was a tremendous success. The dollar became the global currency, spreading all around the world from the west to the east. Everyone was happy to hold it, in large part because if they had any doubts about its value, they could just exchange the dollars they held into gold. The gold standard played a huge role in the incredible socio-economic recovery from the war, mainly in Europe and Japan. Not only that, but it also created enormous economic prosperity in the US all through the 50s and 60s. In 1969, when President Nixon came into office, he realized that since everybody wanted dollars, the Federal Reserve decided to print a lot of dollars. And as a result, there were 4 times as many dollars in circulation as there was gold in reserves. This printing started to be a problem when countries like France started to lose trust in the dollar and began converting dollars into gold, and other countries followed suit shortly after, making inflation rise in the US pretty quickly. This inflation brought a myriad of problems to the US population. So, Nixon, obviously, decides to try to fix it. He fought this by changing a number of things, some of which included freezing wages and prices and putting surcharges on imports, among other things. However, this wasn't solving that much, so he decides to make the seemingly brash decision of abolishing the Bretton Woods system, cancelling the convertibility of the US dollars to gold, letting the US dollar float where it was previously fixed. This allowed other currencies to follow suit and adopt a floating exchange rate, letting them appreciate and depreciate against gold as well as the dollar. There were now no restrictions on the currency used by countries to trade with each other. So, before the end of the gold standard, countries used US dollars in trade because one US dollar was directly linked to a certain amount of gold, and they could convert their dollars into gold at any given moment. That convertibility, value, and trust that came with using the US dollar made it the perfect reserve currency. But why do nations still persist in utilizing the US dollar as both a reserve currency and for international trade, even after the dissolution of the gold standard? Why not just use another currency, or even Bitcoin? Chapter 3. The Police of the World. Everyone knows that the US military is the strongest and most technologically advanced in the world. But of course, funding such an army doesn't come cheap. In 2022 alone, the USA spent $877 billion on its military. To put that into perspective, that's more than what China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, South Korea, Japan, and Ukraine spent in the same year combined. So, why does the US spend so much money on its military? A good way to look at it is seeing the US military as the police force of the world. Just look at this map. These are the US military bases around the globe. As you can see, they're in every continent and every ocean. From the Azores in the Atlantic Ocean to the Arabian Sea. So now you may be asking, okay, but what does that have to do with the US dollar? Well, a lot actually. Consider this scenario. You live in Italy. You've chosen to buy a product from China. After paying, the product is carefully packaged and shipped from a port in China. The ship starts its journey crossing the Indian Ocean, crosses the Suez Canal in the Middle East, and enters the Mediterranean Sea before finally reaching a port in Italy. Sounds straightforward? Trust me, it's not. Chapter 4. The Modern Piracy. In October 2023, we saw what modern piracy can do, with the Houthi rebels in Yemen attacking civilian cargo ships and innocent mariners in the Red Sea, demanding enormous ransoms for the release of their crews. But these incidents aren't new. These practices are more common than you may think. In Somalia, piracy has been a recurring issue for the past 2 decades, particularly in the entrance to the Red Sea. The Suez Canal, which connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, sees about 12% of the world's trade passing through it. For pirates, this bustling waterway represents a good opportunity to target vulnerable ships and demand large sums for their release. As a result, it falls upon someone to safeguard global trade from these modern-day pirates, not just along this route, but also across every vital trade passage essential for maintaining global stability. This is where the US Navy comes into play. The US Navy stands as the sole force with the capability to protect all 5 seas, boasting a naval fleet comprised of 11 aircraft carriers, 10 of which are nuclear powered, along with at least 200 other types of ships capable of exerting terror and fear worldwide. Given this formidable power, one of the primary missions of the US Navy is to safeguard these critical trade routes. If you don't believe me, a simple search of which major countries are engaged in combating Somali and Houthi piracy shows that it's mostly the US, with some help from its allies. Now, another question arises. Why would the US spend so much money every year to protect global trade without any payment? Well, what if I told you that the payment involves using their own currency as the global trade currency? Consider this. I'm the USA, and I can print as many dollars as I want to support my economy, social welfare, military, and so on. However, printing more money causes the value of my dollars to decrease. But this devaluation affects not just me as the USA, but every country that uses and holds my currency. So, this printing only benefits the USA and harms every country that holds any US dollars. In the end, this is just a contract between the USA and the world. The world uses the US dollar, and the US military keeps global trade safe and stable. Now, let's imagine a world without the USA protecting global trade. First, everything imported would be much more expensive, because of the risks associated with navigating in these unwatched seas full of pirates and also countries patrolling ready to demand taxes for passing by. This makes the lives of consumers in countries highly dependent on imported essential goods like food and water much harder, with the prices of these goods increasing exponentially. I believe that over time, a new industry will emerge, something like shipping protection services, where trained and armed individuals would patrol cargo ships along their routes, making life harder for pirates and easier for shipping companies. But no matter what, the world would still experience significant inflation in imported goods. First off, Bitcoin. Many within the Bitcoin community believe that in the near future, Bitcoin could overthrow the US dollar as the primary reserve currency in global trade. They argue that Bitcoin possesses characteristics similar to real gold, along with additional benefits such as its digital nature, which facilitates easy transportation and transfer across the globe. But for the reasons I mentioned earlier, this new replacement would be impossible, at least not in the near future, because Bitcoin can't protect global trade like the US Navy can. The BRICS international currency. BRICS, a group of developing countries that, together, represent around a quarter of the global GDP, with its members being one of the biggest producers in essential sectors like Russia and Saudi Arabia in the natural gas and petrol sector, Brazil in the farming sector, which feeds around 1 billion people a year, and we can't forget about China, the second largest economy in the world, known as the industrial complex of humanity. These countries have decided to launch a new currency which will be used to trade with each other, and countries that want to trade with them have to use it too. So, you can imagine some countries have no other choice but to trade with them. But what made these countries stand up and try to create an alternative to the US dollar? The answer is pretty simple. After President Vladimir Putin sent troops into Ukraine in 2022, the United States and its allies prohibited transactions with Russia's central bank and finance ministry, blocking around $300 billion of sovereign Russian reserves in the West. This marked the first time the dollar was weaponized, causing other countries to view the US dollar as a liability, since the US could do the same to any other country if they did something contrary to its approval. This could pose a real threat to the dominance of the US currency in global trade. However, it's still too early to be certain of anything. Only time will tell. That's it for today's video. I really appreciate you making it to the end of this video, and I'd really appreciate your feedback and what you thought about this video down in the comments below. Thanks guys, and have a good one.